Hi there, and welcome to Central Texas Gardener. I'm Tom Spencer. As hot as it is, you know that spring always returns. But to celebrate the season of renewal with bulbs, we've got to get them in the ground in November. Today, Chris Wiesinger from Southern Bulb Company selects a few of his naturalizing favorites. On tour, visit Lauren and Scott Ogden's garden, designed for dependable structure and welcome surprises.
Against up-close traffic commotion, Scott Ogden and Lauren Springer Ogden temper urban necessity with botanical exploration that represents nature's harvests from around the world. As gardeners, designers, and authors, every site, including their home in Austin, depicts their philosophy of plant-driven design.
For us, I think the beginning of all this is actually looking at nature and looking at other gardens. And so we both spent a lot of time hiking through the hills, wandering along creeks, and looking at old neighborhoods and plants that grow, seeing what happens. And then we've spent time with the plants themselves. And that's the beginning of being able to create a garden, is knowing how the plants grow, knowing what they do in the wild, and being able to bring a little bit of that into your own environment.
When you accept that that really is a relationship between you, a living being, and another living being, it's completely different. And it allows for so much more complexity and change and excitement and surprise and disappointment and all that.
As plant-driven gardeners, Lauren and Scott absorb what each one says to them. In their experiments, they welcome the challenge of communication to respond to the needs of their international partners.
A plant-driven garden, or a garden that's designed with plants first, you don't have to have a lot of money. You don't have to have gone to school and learned all the quote-unquote tenets of design, which we don't believe in anyway. And it just comes with loving certain plants, loving the way they look, and thinking about where would they look best in the garden with what other plants.
That's the thing that really separates a plant-driven design garden from another garden, is that the plants are what is first in mind when you lay it out.
The most important thing I'd say would be that you love it. I want there to be a love affair.
Although they consider whether the passion will be reciprocal, a plan sketch on paper doesn't work for them.
We have a really, really full garden and very layered garden, mainly because we don't have enough room. And so we have to do the fruitcake thing. So
we want it all.
It's a vertical effect. It's 3D gardening, you know?
To be honest, this garden is barely designed. It's stuffed with plants, and one of the few design features is the sedge lawn, and the reason it's here is because we knew it was going to be stuffed with plants everywhere else, and we had to have some kind of quiet place for your eye to rest, so we could have lots of plants and where we could walk. Exactly.
But since they're sensitive to how plants best cohabitate, rhythms of design naturally emerge. Some plants get the job as evergreen structure in diverse foliar renditions.
But they would be inert if we didn't have bulbs shooting through periodically after a rainstorm or in the spring.
That's right.
Or having a few kind of feathery perennials or annuals that come and bloom and then we whack them back and they disappear. Those kind of things have to happen to keep the garden exciting. Gardening is about curiosity and it's about change. A garden that's perfect all the time is a bore. Who wants that? You might as well be at a parking lot in the mall. You actually want to be able to go out the door and see something different, every week, if not every day.
The main reason you want change in the garden is it's human nature, really. If everything looks the same, you actually start to not see it.
In Texas, where plants gently unfold year-round, plant-driven design simmers and anticipates rather than bursting into simultaneous passion.
So you have what's basically sort of a sputtering of different types of plants that have their seasons. So if you don't think about seasonality and plants that come and go, you will have basically a plastic garden. One year there'll be one spot in your garden where there's 3 things that all bloom at the same time and they all look super together, and then it may never happen again. And you know, you have to be okay with unpredictability and okay with the fact that things do die and look awful often, and it's not your fault, but there's so many things that do wonderful things that you can't take credit for either.
Part of it is, you know, real plants, like real people, aren't perfect.
When someone asked why their Clematis armandii was free of spent brown leaves, Scott responded, Lauren picked them off.
And people forget gardens don't exist without gardening. If you don't want to garden, you will never have a real garden. The other thing that's important is to get over the idea of a garden as an installation project. That's once it's done, it's done. It's never done.
I don't think everyone needs to have a layered garden or even a naturalistically modeled garden. It's really not about whether it's formal or informal or whether it's overstuffed like our garden or whether it's a little more sparse. But the main thing is that you have plants that you really enjoy.
All right, thanks so much, Scott and Lauren, for sharing your garden with us, 2 of my favorite gardening folks. And now I'm going to be joined by another of my favorite gardening folks, Chris Wiesinger. Thank you so much for being back to Central Texas Gardener.
Tom, I'm always excited, so thanks for having me.
Well, for those who don't know Chris, he's been a regular guest on the show for the past few years. He is the proprietor of the Southern Bulb Company, collector of heirloom bulbs from throughout the South. Find the right bulbs for us in this very tough climate.
Right, and been influenced by folks like Scott Ogden, so how exciting. Very heavily influenced.
Right.
Absolutely.
And this year is a big year for you. Not only is the business really moving quickly for you, but you're celebrating a release of a book, which we're going to be talking about, Heirloom Bulbs for today.
Absolutely, yeah. And, you know, we go over some of the major superstars that you find. It's definitely not all-inclusive.
Right. Well, you know, we've talked a lot in the past about a lot of the fall blooming bulbs, the things like the lycoris and the oxblood lilies, but we're going to try to mix it up a little bit this year.
Right.
But before we do, let's talk about the impact of this weather on the bulbs we're going to be discussing.
Sure. I mean, you know, crinums are surviving this year. And we think
okay, well, let's just pull this. I think we know why this would survive, just the scale of it.
Exactly. It has enough to dry down, enough leaves to sort of cover it. And then they're tough bulbs. And
I love the crinums.
Yeah, crinums are a lot of fun. They don't look like much, but when they bloom, they're spectacular when they bloom at 100 degrees.
Yeah, right.
And it's really hot. And we, and down here in Austin, when we think about bulbs, we think about some of those that bloom in the fall. But, you know, we can enjoy those, but as those bloom, we realize the seasonality of things, and the hot weather will be over.
Right.
And we'll move to some other bulbs.
Right. And spring, that's what everybody really thinks about when they think of bulbs, the spring blooming varieties. And we're going to be we're really going to be keying in on those during our conversation today. Before we do talk about particular varieties, so let's give folks an idea of how to prepare a good home for bulbs here in this in these tough conditions that we have in Central Texas.
Right, right. And one thing I've come to realize is just because we see these bulbs do well on old home sites, that doesn't mean, like I used to think maybe when I was younger, you could just take any of these bulbs and just plop them down in dry, hard rock soil and that they would survive. It takes a little bit of prep, you know. A lot of those old home sites had prepped soil. And so one of the things you want to definitely make sure you do is mix in enough organic matter to where there's some moisture retention in there if it's just awful, awful soil.
Right. Drainage, I always think of drainage when I think of bulbs as well. Any kind of rock mineral content?
You can. It's definitely important that a lot of the bulbs aren't in standing water. But, you know, beyond that, some of the bulbs are okay, and they're not the best drained soils. In fact, some kind of like it dry, and we'll talk about a couple of those bulbs.
Great. Well, before we turn to the bulbs themselves, I just want people to appreciate a little bit of the work that went into the book. And this, first off, I have to say, it's beautiful.
Thanks.
It's beautifully organized.
Thanks.
I'm very impressed by that. Very readable as well. Tell me your aims for the book.
You know, that's a really great question because it is aimed and and geared towards somebody who doesn't really understand what this whole heirloom bulb thing is about. You might see one or two in an old home site blooming. Well, this book says if you're new to it and you're curious about bulbs in Texas and the South, here are the major superstars that you would find. Here's the time of year you'd find them. Here's just some of my stories as I collected them. But here's what you would find if you were to be a bulb hunter and go out. Here are the top,
That's great.
20, 30 bulbs that you would find in these locations.
And how to use them in your own garden.
And then how to use them in your own garden. We talked about the soil prep, and that is important.
Right.
Good drainage is important for most of them. Don't want them in standing water.
Right.
Although some like it, we mentioned that.
Yeah.
And then you think about the fertilizer needs. You really don't have to fertilize, but I have realized some of the bulbs, especially like the greedy crinums.
Yeah, they are a little greedy.
Yeah, they are. They will really take up anything you give them. So you want to stay away from a lot of nitrogen. If you think about bulbs, they're very grass-like foliage. They are monocots. You shoot them with too much nitrogen, like you would give a lawn, you'll get a lot of foliage and not a lot of blooms.
Sure.
But if you look at potassium and phosphorus, the last two numbers on that 3 number on the bag ratio, you want higher numbers of those. If all you can find is the even, you can do a light dose of that.
Right. Okay. Well, there's some of the basics, and I really do encourage folks to look at the book. You can find that. It's going to be a great addition to your home garden library. But let's talk about some of the superstars that you've been talking about. Now, everybody loves narcissus.
Right.
I have to say that some of my fondest memories of childhood deal with narcissus. But what are the best varieties that you've encountered for those of us who live in the South?
Right. And if you're not familiar with what a narcissus is, when we talk about daffodils, you know, that's a narcissus, a type of narcissus. But here we're a little more accustomed to narcissus because we think about narcissus bulbs as having a little bit of a smaller bloom. And generally it's these smaller blooming narcissus or smaller daffodils, multi-flowering, that will do better for us. And when we think about those things, we obviously think about the Tazettas. And a narcissus Tazetta bulb that everybody thinks about would be a paper white. But if you don't like the smell of a paper white, you can go with those a little more dark yellow in the cup and that bloom later in the year, a little more cold hardy, like the Grand Primos. It's one of the
beautiful plant.
Beautiful plant. Nice big narcissus bulbs, bigger than a typical daffodil bulb. Sends up 2 to 3 flower stalks. Think about bulbs like Golden Dawn. That's yellow petals and darker gold cups. Sweet, sweet smell to knock your socks off. Blooms in March.
You know, some people do complain about the paper. I like paper whites too.
I give a lot of talks to garden clubs, and I always ask them, how many of you like the smell of paper whites? And half their hands go up. How many of you don't like the smell of paper whites? And the other half goes up. It is split right down the middle.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but a nice selection there of narcissus to choose from. And it's one that I'm very excited to talk about is a tulip that you actually use the term Georgetown tulip. I've never heard this before. Tulip praecox, right?
Yeah, well, there's been lots of nicknames. Tulipa praecox. My old professor, Bill Welch, Dr. Bill Welch, calls it the Georgetown tulip. Because when he was a student at Southwestern, he saw a small patch of them blooming in a yard, and he mentioned it to me when I began my bulb hunting adventures almost 8 years ago. And I went back, and half the yard in that little town in Georgetown was full of this red blooming tulip. And so he calls it the Georgetown tulip. Some of us call it the Texas tulip. Because it just does so well in Texas. But it's an early blooming red tulip. It's phototropic, so it's closed in the mornings. But as the sun comes out in the day, it just opens up.
And see, that makes it even more special, I think, you know, to see that the cycle of that flower.
Yes, yeah. And it just reminds you about the seasonality of life and the cyclic nature of our own lives. When it opens up, jet black center, lined with a honeybee yellow. And what's best is, you know, I've seen this bulb like you would clumps of daffodils on old home sites in central Texas. I've seen patches of it along old fence rows, just naturalizing on old lots. But it likes it dry in the summertime.
Well, we can supply that.
We've got that taken care of.
Right.
But that's Tulipa praecox. It's an early blooming red tulip.
Wow, that sounds really exciting. Now, another one that I have to say I'm just really fired up about is a fall blooming crocus.
Well, they call it the fall blooming crocus or autumn daffodil. Sternbergia.
Sternbergia is
the genus name.
Okay.
Sternbergia lutea. It's a very Mediterranean bulb.
Okay.
Which makes you think, sure, around this neck of the woods in Texas it would do well.
Yeah.
It is amazing. It's just like the oxblows and the spiders. It's dormant in the summertime, and then when the fall hits, late September, October, buttercup, yellow blooms just start popping up, trumpet-shaped blooms. And we've seen them do this just on old empty lots.
Yeah.
And dappled shade to full sun, completely dry, no irrigation, and all of a sudden these yellow blooms start popping
put this
up.
together with the red blooms, the lycoris and the things
and
like
the oxblood lilies, rhodophylla, it's stunning, absolutely stunning in the fall. Supply is a little limited, but kind of harder to find. All over Israel, believe it or not, and it does well here in Austin.
Well, it would make sense in that Middle Eastern dry climate, and real briefly, we only have a few seconds here, but I want to mention one variety of amaryllis, and I want to talk about Johnson's amaryllis.
Yeah, and, the very first hybrid amaryllis, 1790. Some folks still say it's the best hybrid amaryllis, and the hybridization was done by a man named Johnson, English watchmaker. Red with white stripes, very old, pointy-petaled look, blooms in April, smells great. Believe it or not, you plant it in the fall, normally, and it'll kind of grow in the wintertime, but really grows late February, blooms in April with a fragrance, an amaryllis with a fragrance.
Great.
Knocks your socks off.
Okay, well, folks can find Chris at southernbulbs.com, and highly recommend that. And again, the new book, Heirloom Bulbs for Today. Congratulations to you and to your co-author, Cherie Colburn.
Yes, Cherie Colburn, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, terrific. Well, thank you, Chris. It's always a pleasure to see
Tom.
you. Best of luck.
Thanks.
And coming up next is our friend Daphne.
Hello and welcome to Down to Earth. I'm Daphne Richards. This week's question is, why didn't my iris bloom? Well, there are several possibilities. Most likely, they become overgrown and crowded, and it's past time to divide them. To do this, you'll need to dig them up with a shovel and simply cut them into pieces. If the clump of leaves is really large, you'll probably need to do this with the shovel, the cutting. You don't have to be too careful when you're doing this. Irises are pretty tough. Divide the plant into smaller clumps, which should be fairly obvious as to how to divide them, what size. But if not, brush away some of the soil from the surface until you find the rhizome, the underground stem. Then push back the leaves and use a large, sharp knife to cut through the rhizome and the roots below. Then you should plant one of these smaller clumps back into the original hole and fill that with soil around it, because it will be a larger hole. You also should find a new home in your garden for the other clumps that you have, or find a friend to share a pass-along plant. If the plant does not seem to be overgrown and perhaps has yellow flowers and yellow leaves, it could also be that the plant needs a little fertilizer. You can go ahead and fertilize now, and in this case, I would suggest using a fertilizer with a nutrient ratio designed to encourage blooming. These products have low nitrogen, and that's the first number on the label. That's low nitrogen compared to the phosphorus, that's the second number on the label. Nitrogen encourages green growth, so lowering the amount of nitrogen will encourage the plant to focus most of its energy on producing flowers instead of leaves. One other possibility is that your iris may not be getting enough sun. And if that's the case, simply dig it up and move it to a sunnier spot. Our plant this week, keeping with our question, we decided to highlight bearded iris. Although these are not native, they are fabulously adapted to our climate and soils. In fact, there's virtually nowhere in the nation where irises don't perform well. The large, dense flowers are simply beautiful, and they remind me of my grandmother, who had lots of bearded irises in her garden. These are also known as German irises, and they're usually taller than other irises. Since they're clumping, they do tend to spread a bit, but if they outgrow their space, just divide them and they'll look and perform much better for you. Irises seem to thrive in virtually all conditions, from heavy soil to loose sand. But rocky soil isn't really the best, and if you have heavy clay, be careful not to overwater and cause the rhizomes to rot. When they're not blooming, the spiky leaves of these plants add wonderful structure to our gardens, but with their height and their 6 to 7 inch blooms and those bold flower colors, they do tend to be overwhelming in most any space. So be careful not to plant them among more delicate plants in your garden that might be overwhelmed by their presence. And be sure to give your irises plenty of sun, or at the very least, not too much shade. Our pet this week is Jack, a miniature schnauzer who loves his dad's garden, and we do too. Seth Moore set up this gorgeous bird bath for other garden friends, but they're willing to share with Jack. Hey, being on constant lookout for squirrels can make a guy thirsty. To do in your garden this week, with autumn, which is the best time of year to plant a tree, approaching, go tree shopping and go ahead and dig that hole so you'll be ready to go once the temperatures begin to stay reliably cooler. You should also divide those spring blooming plants now. We'd love to hear from you, so please visit klru.org/CTG to send us your questions, favorite plants, and garden pets.
Thanks, Daphne. Now let's check in with Trisha Shirey for Backyard Basics.
One of the real keys to success with gardening is to utilize row cover. Now, lightweight row cover can do a lot of things in the garden besides just protect from cold and wind damage. Lightweight row cover like this one, you can see through it very easily, will keep insects and birds off your plants and from eating your seedlings and prevent the insects from spreading diseases to your plants. The only way I can get squash to the point of harvest is by using this lightweight row cover. I put it over my squash plants at the time of planting, and I leave it on the plants until they start producing female flowers. The first flowers are usually male, and so I pull it off to allow the bees to pollinate it. And by that time, the plants are up and growing fairly large, and they can outgrow any vine borers that might happen to attack them, and I'll get a good 6 weeks of harvest from them. You can also protect your plants from grasshoppers with this lightweight row cover. If you're trying to seed a lawn and you have birds eating every seed that you plant, you can shade large areas with the row cover and just put it directly on the plant. It preserves moisture and shades the seeds a little bit, so it can definitely help you get seeds to germinate more easily. With fall planting, sometimes it's so hot and so dry that it's difficult to get seeds to grow. So this lightweight row cover can make a huge difference in your success with getting things going when it's still actually quite hot. This is a polypropylene fabric, and it dries very quickly. You can store it easily by folding it up and putting it out of sunlight, and it should last for years if you take good care of it. I put mine in a plastic garbage can with a cover, store it away, and then I can carry that can out to the garden when I need to cover things quickly. You can purchase the row cover pre-cut or by the foot if you have a large garden bed, and I tend to cut mine in lengths that are long enough to cover the entire bed with a little bit of overage to seal up the ends. The lightweight row cover will block about 15 to 20% of the sun. The heavyweight can protect up to 15 degrees or even more, and it will block anywhere from 30 to 50% of the sunlight. So you'll need to pull back the heavyweight row cover on days where you need the plants to get more sun. Now you can put the row cover directly on the plants. This floating row cover is ideal for that, but the heavyweight row cover doesn't protect the plants as well. If it gets ice or frost on it, it can actually damage the plants. And so what I like to use is rebar, and I get this 3/8 rebar from home stores, and I bend it into hoops, and you'll need to start bending it gradually. So I'll start on one side and bend, then go to the other side and bend around a large tree or a post, a sturdy post, and then you can gradually make that bend into the hoop. And then those the ends just get shoved down into the soil 3 or 4 inches deep, and they're quite sturdy. You can actually use this for deer netting as well, and you can put the row cover right over the deer netting. Now, to secure the row cover to the hoops, I use spring clamps. You can use 2-inch or 4-inch spring clamps, and that holds the deer netting and the row cover on. And then pull the clamps off, lift the netting, and you can get to what you need to harvest. You can use soil staples or rocks or boards to hold the netting down, but a lot of times that puts put holes in the row cover, and it tears it if it's really windy. Now, if your row cover does start to get kind of holey and torn, save the pieces because they can still be useful for seed beds, for wrapping individual plants. You can filter fertilizer mixes, or if you're collecting water, you can make fabric covers for your mosquito buckets to keep mosquitoes out. Heavy fabric should always be opened on warm days. Often in the wintertime, we'll be down to 25 degrees one day, and then it's hot and sunny and almost 80 the next day. So make sure you open the row cover so that your plants don't cook. And also include the soil in the row cover. The soil is what conducts the heat to protect the plant, so don't just wrap the top of a plant. Moist soil always conducts heat better, so before a freeze, make sure that you're watering well, and that row cover and hot weather row cover will help you be more successful with your garden. I'm Trisha Shirey for Backyard Basics.
Visit klru.org/CTG to watch online, get plant lists, and follow our blog. Next week, get ideas for deer country. Until then, I'll see you in the garden.
To learn about today's program, watch online, and follow CTG's blog, check out klru.org/CTG.